Hello, I'm Sally Pointer. I'm filming today from the Bronze Age settlement at Archeon, which is an open-air museum in the Netherlands. I've been lucky enough to have been here for the last few days, helping to demonstrate skills and techniques that we know from the European Bronze Age. And today I'm taking the opportunity to explore a type of garment that is quite characteristic, but has remained a little bit of a mystery. Not that much so far is known about how it's made. We're going to have a try today, see if we can solve any of those little mysteries. As well as a number of cloth caps from the Danish Bronze Age, we have several examples of these really enigmatic high-status caps. These are hemispherical, they're made of thick layers of wool quilted together, and most importantly, the surface is covered with this pile of very, very fine threads. These have been mentioned by many researchers. Margareta Hald in particular wrote a great deal of detail about these, but even she says that we don't really understand them because they're still so complete that it's very, very hard to get up close to them. This is where experimentation can really help. It probably won't solve everything, but let's see if we can understand these better. This video actually has two introductions. And the reason for that is that when I started this project, I'd looked, but I hadn't been able to find much previous work done on these hats. And in particular, I hadn't found any previous reconstructions. Now, I suspected at the time that I was missing things, probably because I'm fundamentally an English speaker, and my search terms when I'm looking online and looking in online libraries are in English. And I know that a lot of the work on these hats would have been done in German, in Danish, other languages as well. But I did my best with the information available, and I wasn't unhappy with progress until I got 2/3 of the way through this project, when a very, very kind friend sent me copies of some mid-century texts that have the information that I'd been looking for from the word go. Now, it would be tempting to say, oh no, all my current thinking isn't quite right. But you know what? That's what experimental archaeology is all about. We keep learning, we keep building on things. So I'm going to keep going with the first part of this video. And then at about the point when I get this new information, I'm going to bring that into play. And we'll have a look at what difference that makes to my working methods. Let's see how far I got by myself. And let's see what improvements we can make once we've stopped reinventing the wheel and we've drawn on previous scholarly work. I love being an experimental archaeologist. It's so much fun to get things wrong occasionally. I've got a practice hat on the go. This is never intended to be terribly tidy, terribly perfect. It's letting me experiment with some of the constructional elements and try different knots just to see what works. But when I come to make my slightly better version soon, this is the fabric I'm going to use. These are offcuts from making one of the male kidney-shaped cloaks. It's a very heavy tabby weave wool that's been well fulled. So fulling is felting, the shrinking of a ready-made fabric, which makes it denser, more fray resistant and quite weatherproof. It is highly likely that these caps, even though they're high-status objects, were made from remnants of fabric, and several of the analyses have shown piecing in crowns and sides, probably because they're using the offcuts from cloaks. They're very, very thick. We know that at least one of them is 1 centimetre thick at the edge. I'm going to use 3 layers to make my edge. But partly because the fabric I had lent itself to it, but partly because I don't think the crown needs to be quite so dense, I'm going to use 2 pieces for the crown. Initial construction can be quite straightforward. Danish Bronze Age needles are often quite interesting. They're frequently double-ended, and they're known in bronze, they're known in bone. I know of at least one gold one. It's on display in the National Museum of Copenhagen. And these double-ended needles are really very efficient to use, very, very sharp. There are some of the more familiar types around as well, but we do see lots and lots of these. So I'm just going to use a simple whip stitch to join together the sides of my cap, and then I'm going to catch the crown into place. Some do use a looping construction, but I'm not sure whether I'm going to do that with this particular one. It's there to add flexibility, but it's not necessarily there in all the known versions. These double-ended needles really are very efficient. I'm just using 1 point at the moment, but there's absolutely no reason why you can't do a stitch where you then go back through in the same direction, so you're using both points simultaneously. When it comes to doing the knots on the top, they're really quite a useful idea. You don't have to be too tidy with this either. This is all going to be covered later on. So whip stitching the side pieces together really is just a case of get it done. Don't overthink it. Although the fabric of the hats is a densely fulled tabby weave, the sewing and the knots are done in a very fine 2-ply worsted spun wool. It's not much thicker than a sewing thread. So I've used the sort of wool yarn that is sold for tablet weavers today. That's a really good approximation of the type of yarn that's being used at the time. The contrast between the two is interesting because this is fulled, so it's fluffy and it's meshed together. This is smooth and silky, and this is one of the reasons that how we know that the stitching and the knots are done after the fabric for the hat has been fulled and finished. You've got two very, very different textures. These are a slightly different colour, it's just because that's what I had to hand. Of course, the hats now are archaeological brown. They've been buried in a tannin-rich atmosphere for a long time, but I think they were dark to start with. So nothing more complicated than that. That's my sides. I'm going to make 3 of those, stack them together, and then we are going to do a little whip stitch just to hold all 3 layers together. So one of the features of these hats is that although elements of the construction are coarse, there are some really fine details. This is the inside layer of my nice hat, and it's based on one that has the top edge of the side piece has a row of blanket stitches, so very straightforward stitches along the top edge. But when I get to the end of this row, it's going to turn into several rows of simple looping. Now, you've seen that in quite a lot of my other videos. It's a very ancient technique related to the earliest forms of knarl binding, which makes very flexible baskets. But you see it in Northern European textiles sometimes as a joining element. And what it's going to do is it's going to join the round top eventually with a short flexible section. So I'm only going to do a few stitches now just to give you the idea of what's going on. So blanket stitch, needle goes in, needle comes up, and you pull through the thread. I'm using a long thread because it's much easier to use a decent length than it is to endlessly rejoin. And now I'm coming up on my starting point. So I'll slow down a little bit now. So now, rather than going into the fabric, I'm going to go into the loop made by the previous row. So I'm going into the loop and picking up. And that's going to make a slightly open work, needle lace if you want to think of it that way, needle lace type row that will, after 2 or 3 rows, be joined to the edge of the top part. We'll come back to that a bit later. So having made several rows of looping at the edge, and I could easily have done another 1 or 2 here, I need to join the crown piece to it. And this is quite straightforward. I've had a couple of goes. I started off with a normal blanket stitch, quickly realised I had it the wrong way up, and I've got it sussed now. So you take an ordinary blanket stitch into the corner, and then you pick up the next available loop from the row beneath. That makes a little figure 8, which holds everything together. So it's a little stitch, pick up the row below, and that essentially makes an extra row of linking to keep it together. You can also ease the top and bottom pieces together, so you can, by making these stitches closer together or wider, you can adapt how the fit goes. So I'll just do 1 or 2 more stitches and then my lining will be done. I'll just get my hand behind that so you can see what's going on. So we've got a really nice few rows of simple looping, which gives this beautiful, soft, flexible curve to the lining of the hat. Well, mostly I'm happy with this. The effect where it's tidy is absolutely beautiful. Unfortunately, I've got a bit over here that is not tidy because I had the wrong amount of fabric left over and I had to take some really big stitches to ease it in. I'll do better next time. This is the first time I've done this particular hat in this way, and I'm learning a huge amount as I go. But yeah, look at that. Where it's nice, it's really nice. I've just started to assemble all 3 layers together. So I'd started off by sewing together one of the round crowns and a side piece. Then we had the second inside layer, and then the internal one, which is the one with the simple looping. And then 3 layers are just being sewn together with a very, very simple whip stitch just to hold them together, and it's taking what is best part of a centimetre down into a much more tightly compressed edge. Bronze needle is working absolutely fantastically for this. There's nothing complicated about this stage, just sew it together. Once the edges are sewn together, you'll probably notice that you've got a lot of wrinkles around the inside. That's absolutely fine. We know from the originals that there are lots and lots and lots of little tiny stab stitches. So your next thing to do is essentially quilt the layers together without being too precise about it, but just take lots of little tiny stab stitches here, there and everywhere until the layers bind together. Now I've just done, I don't know if you can see them, I've just done a few here. I just ran diagonally up the side of my hat, and already that's making that little section lie much flatter. So tiny little stitches, they're not going to show in the end, but get those layers sitting together nicely, and then you should find that that inner layer looks really quite nice against everything.
Een soort gedachtegang om 1 uur even gezamenlijk af te spreken bij Romeinse lusthof, noem ik het maar even, het restaurant daar. Om maar gewoon even, even gezamenlijk even wat mee. Bij elkaar te zijn. Geef het ook aan anderen.
Well, it's lunchtime and the hat is starting to look like a hat. I've been working on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stitches, which don't have to be tidy. They're just there to hold all those layers together. There's that simple looping on the inside. I think another hour's stitching and I'll be able to start doing the fun bits, the corded layer and then the tufts. But first, time for a break. Well, we've come to the end of our time here at Archeon. It's very soon time to say goodbye to all the lovely reconstructed buildings and the lovely staff and the lovely, lovely visitors. But the hat has got to the point where, yes, it's very, very ugly at this stage, but it is a wearable hat. It's very thick. I'm going to get it home, I'm going to rinse it, and I'm going to block it to shape, and that will make it a lot easier to put the spacing for the decorative internal stitches in the right places. But for now, that is really lovely and stiff. It has taken me, with demonstrating to the visitors and trying things out, 3 days to get to this stage completely. And there's a lot of work still to go. I'm home from Archeon now, very sad to have said goodbye to it, and I've given this hat a little rinse through and a quick block on a wooden hat block. That has immediately made it much, much rounder, and those looping stitches inside really have smoothed the transition. But it's also shown me that I've made it just a tiny bit on the long side. We know from looking at the reference material, the 4 that survive, sorry I'm waving that around a lot in the background, that they're about 15 or 16 centimetres tall, and that brings it to somewhere in this vicinity. So I need to chop this off round about there, and that's absolutely fine. I'll lose a couple of rows of stab stitching, it's no big deal. I need to trim that and I'll redo the edge. And then I think we're just about ready to start on the fun bit. Now that surplus bit has been trimmed off, the proportions are much better. And it's quite interesting looking at the layers on the side. I quite like the effect at the moment, but you can really clearly see how thick this is. So I just need to stitch the edges down again. I can stay with the whip stitch I used originally, or I might take the opportunity to have a look at a slightly fancier edge treatment that occurs on 1 or 2 of the caps. But for now, that can go back on its head until I'm ready to work on it. This is the edging that we're going to try. It's been identified on the Trintage cap, which is the one that we're most closely basing this approximation on. So what we need to do first is secure the edge layers with a row of buttonhole stitches, blanket stitches. And then there are 3 separate threads that are whipped through them to make a rope edge effect. Now, if this works, it makes a really smart edging. So the first thing that I need to do is load up a needle, and we will do a row of blanket stitches and get those edges caught back together. One thing that's fun about this project is that you don't have to hide the knots on the end of threads. In fact, I'm deliberately making them extra large because this is going to be covered with knots later anyway. But this is what we're up to. Little row of blanket stitches. I'm keeping them quite small and neat, and you can really see how that's compressing the edge and is starting the foundation for this rope work edge. This is going to take me a little while to do, so I'm just going to work quietly around the edge. I have briefly swapped back to a modern needle. The only reason for that is because my bronze ones are still hidden in my packing from being in the Netherlands last week. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the bronze needles. In fact, I'm really enjoying using them, and I intend to keep using them for most of the hat. That's already made a much, much neater edge. I've allowed the rib of the blanket stitch to sit just slightly towards the inside of the hat. I hope that was the right choice. I've done it that way because I'm assuming that the pile on the outside is going to slightly obscure things, and I want this cording to really, really show up. So what we need to do next, let me see if I can zoom in a little bit without losing focus. Okay, so you can see you've got lots of individual stitches here. So this spiral whipping essentially just takes the needle through 1 stitch, misses 2, through 1 stitch, misses 2, through 1 stitch, misses 2. The next row will start on the next stitch along, through 1 stitch, miss 2, so it'll cross over with the row beneath. And the third one does the same. So you're building a cord caught in to these edge stitches. I think that will make sense as I start doing it. It should make for a really tidy, smooth, corded detail right on this very, very edge. So the way that this works is you have the bar of the blanket stitch, you put your needle behind that and under the top bar. That essentially takes it right through the loop. Then you count 1, the stitch you've just taken, 2, 3, and you do it again. So the needle is going behind the upright of the blanket stitch, behind the cross piece of the blanket stitch. Let me do this one-handed, of course. Pull everything through, and then when you see it from the side, it makes this really lovely rope. Now that's only the first row. We're going to do 2 more of those so that the stitches are going to lie in between to make the really corded edge. I think that made sense. Hopefully that made sense. This is the final row going in, and you can see, I hope, that beautiful rope edging that it makes. I am going to do a little clip in a moment using different colours of thread just so that you can see the mechanics of this, because I do appreciate that dark brown on mid-brown wool is not necessarily the easiest thing to see. But this, yeah, I can really see why they did this. It makes such a refined edging. Not hard to do. Probably an hour's work to do the brim. So, yeah, it adds a little bit of time, but nothing too horrific. And that's going to make a really, really beautiful edging. Let's have a look at how this rope edging works. So it's on a blanket stitch foundation chain. So that's nothing complicated at all. Needle goes in, comes up through its existing loop. Now when you look at this closely, what it's making are stitches where the threads cross over and are quite firmly supported. The bits in between, the bar, if you like, is a bit bouncier. For this foundation to work, when we put the chain in, or the cord in, we need to go through that crossover bit each time. So we're going to do this just in 3 colours so you can see what's going on. So I've gone through a crossover bit. I count 1, 2, and I go through the 3rd crossed over bit. 1, 2, I go through the 3rd. 1, 2, and I go through the 3rd. Now that makes a little rope edging in its own right, but it's sparse, it's only whipping the edge. So for my next one, this would all have been done in the same colour, but I'm going to use red so you can see what's going on. We went through this one, and then we counted. So we're going to go through the next one. We've gone through here. Count 1, 2, and you go through the next crossover point. Count 1, 2, through the next crossover point. Then you count 1, 2, and you go through the next crossover point. 1, 2, I think we can just get one more in here for the sake of argument. Alright, so you can see that there is quite a nice little chain coming along there. We want one more colour to make this work, so I'm just going to use a yellow thread, which is actually looking a bit ratty, but we won't worry about it too much. Just anchor it there. This is only a practice. Alright, so I'm looking for the last piece that I haven't put a stitch through, and it's blue, red here, yellow goes through here. Same thing again, count 1, 2, go through the next one. Count 1, 2, and that goes through the next one. Now what I have found when I've been working on this is that in this row it's easy to lose your place and not see where the right stitch is. So I'm having that problem here. I went through I went through that one, I went through this one, so it's probably got to be that one. It's even in multicolours. This is a little harder to see, but what you can do is you can just see where it naturally lies, and as long as the cording lies in the right place, it's going to be absolutely fine. So there we are. I really like it in 3 colours. I think I'm very, very tempted at some point to do a modern version of this and use bright colours just to help me illustrate what's going on. I think that's a lot of fun. The next thing that needs doing are the concentric rows of stitching on the inside of the cap. Now this one is Muldbjerg. The Trintage one is very, very similar. This one has 16 rows, Trintage has 15. They vary slightly. So a number of rows, roughly the distance apart of a pencil, I would guess. You can see that. You can see that corded edging that we've just done really nicely there. In fact, that's a really good bit. Can you see the blanket stitch just there into which the edging has worked? We've just done that bit. Now we need to do this bit. This bit is done in a fairly similar way, except, I'll just flip to a different page, it only needs 2 rows running into it. So I need to make lots of little stitches. If there aren't already some, I can go into the fabric, and then I need to do a couple of rows of stitching. Let's return to my scrap of waste fabric to show you what's going on with these
this particular rope edging. So when we set up the hat, we use many tiny stitches to hold it together. But what I found is that it's worth doing another running stitch just to give something to foundation this too. So I'm just going to put a few stitches in, not too many, don't want you to be bored watching this bit. We think, certainly based on Margarita Hall's observations of these hats, that where there isn't a stitch available, people are just picking up the fabric itself, but we'll give ourselves a few bits to work on. Now, if you remember that this edging used 3 overlapping strands, we practiced them in blue, yellow and red. This one only uses 2, so we're going to start, which one's to hand? The red's to hand. Let's start with the red. Okay, I'm not going to worry about the tails for this, so you just go through one, miss one, and then you go through the next one. Miss one, go through the next one, miss one. Oh, and look, I don't have a stitch there, so I'm just going to borrow a little bit of fabric. That'll do for our quick test. And then we need another colour. Let's use the yellow to run these together. It's the same general idea. So just catch the end nice and tight. And in this case, you're going to go through the in-between stitch. So we go under this one, miss that one, under this one, miss that one, under this one, miss that one, and oh yes, at the end I'm missing a stitch, so we're just going to pick up a little bit of fabric, and that gives you a little rope edging. Now, the embroiderers amongst you might think, why don't they just do a stem stitch?
That's an upside down back stitch to the rest of us.
Because this really does look like stem stitch. We don't know why they didn't do it that way. What they are doing is making the most of all these little tiny stitches that are already there because they've held the layers together to catch these down. If I was just doing a stem stitch, all I'd be doing is catching the very top bits of the fabric, and it wouldn't be part of the mechanism that holds the whole lot together. So that seems to be why they're doing it. But again, do it tidily, do it tight. These are very tiny little stitches. You get a very beautiful rope edge, which is similar to, but not quite as complex as this one. Hopefully that makes sense. Now then, I have got a lot of these to do. I'd better get on with it.
I'm about halfway through this now, I think. So there's the little running stitches going in, and then they get whipped over to make the cordage. There is no doubt that I haven't got as many rows as the originals have. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is 7. I reckon it's going to be 8, 9, 10, 11. I might manage 12, which is the minimum. So 12, I think, is the lowest number that we've spotted on the originals of these. Anyway, it's looking beautiful. I really like this effect. I am finding it's easiest to work with the hat turned inside out. It just seems logical. If I pop it back the right way around, you can see that all the ends of my threads I'm leaving on the outside, and they're becoming some of the tufts that will soon be covering the entire hat. It is really quite fun being able to deliberately leave your ends on show, and it's given me a chance to practice the knot that I think is the most likely, but we'll come back to that in a moment. For now, that really is looking quite nice. And that's 12 rounds done. It is not as even as I would like. It comes right near the top here, and it's got a little bit of a gap there. But this is the first one of these that I've done, and I've learnt a lot about how it works. This is, of course, inside out at the moment. I'm going to turn it right way round. I might give it one last rinse through and dry it over the hat blocks so it's in the most perfect shape I can get it, because now
it's time to start the pile. This is a close-up picture of one of the surviving hats. Have a close look at these knots. They are really, really unusual, and I've been struggling to get a knot that works for this. Now, I've been assuming up to this point that these are all individual threads with a knot tied in the end. I'm not so sure they are. Look at the very, very round ends that we've got going on there. Something interesting is happening. Let's try out this possible stitch strategy. So if this works, it works because the original thread is a single, not a plied thread. So ignore the fact that this stunt thread is plied. Just imagine that that is singles. So your thread will be coming out of the hat, and then what I think you do is you essentially make a bullion stitch, a French knot, where you want the knot to form. You can pull that really, really tight, and by using the needle to gauge where it goes, you can get it to work at exactly the right spot. Then what you do is you twist your thread very, very tightly, hold the knot, and it plies back on itself. Now that gives you that really round double knot at the end that cannot possibly slip off. We also know there's another little knot closer to the bottom, so that you can achieve just by taking a little stitch knot hybrid into the bottom. Put your needle in, bring it up in the next available spot, do the same thing. Again, use your needle to gauge where the stitch is going. Pull through your bullion stitch, finger ply it back on itself, make that little knot, preferably without splitting a thread, that goes around the base. That helps stop it flopping through. And I haven't solved this two threads coming up in the same place yet, but I think you can just bring your needle back up out of essentially the same hole. So that's the principle of it. It's not perfect. I'm not convinced it's right, but for the thread that I currently have available, it's giving good results. And at least the knots are staying nice around and they're not going to drop off the top. Now if we have a look at a little bit that I've been trying that with, this is the sort of effect we get. I think my yarn's a little bit chunky, so I do think I'm going to need to resolve that if I use this method. But it is giving us these lovely, almost little drumstick bobbles. I've tried doing it in patches where the threads come out of the same hole. It's all right. It's not perfect. It's all right. What we need is a little bit more information about what's going on. If I can't find any though, this method will definitely work, even though I'm not sure it's absolutely right. And at this point, I get access to those new documents. When I say new documents, they've been around for a very, very long time. I just hadn't had access to them. So let's have a look at what they say, and we'll see what we can learn, and we'll see what improvements we can make. Karl Schlabo was a German archaeologist. He was born towards the end of the 19th century. He didn't die until he was well into his 90s, in the 1980s, I think. And he was absolutely pivotal in helping people understand early textile archaeology. I've known of his work for a long time. It's just really hard to get in the UK. So I've not had a chance to read it. But thankfully, these PDFs have come my way, and we've got two texts to draw on now. One was written way back in the 1930s, 1937 for this one, and the other one was written in 1962. I think let's start by looking at a page out of the 1962 volume.
I've taken the liberty of printing out one of the relevant pages so I can scribble on it. Now, here are the key findings. There are 8 of these known. Now, I didn't know that. So Mielberg, Trindhoj, Goldhoj, Boromeshof, knew about those. But Bjelderup, Bollesleben, Toppenhoy and Harrisley, and I'm sure I pronounced those terribly, do forgive me, are ones that I wasn't familiar with. 8 of them. That's absolutely amazing. So the first 4 are in the National Museum of Denmark. They're the ones that I've seen on several occasions. Now then, the Harrisley find is in quite poor condition, and that's the one that's been looked at in a lot of detail to help understand how it was made. It's made of 3 layers. Woohoo! I got that bit right. Mine's made of 3 layers as well. He also feels that a wooden hat block has been used at the point at which the layers were felted together. Now, I did that too. Great, so far we are in agreement. What else have we got? Okay, now, do you remember when we were looking at the stitches on the side? Hald thinks it's running stitches that are whipped over, and I postulated that it looks very, very similar to stem stitch. Now, this particular report believes it's stem stitch. Now, that is actually quite interesting. Stem stitch is a little bit easier to work, a little bit faster, and for a lot of us who are used to modern embroidery, a bit neater. So, you've got an option. You can do it the way Hull does, or you can do it in stem stitch. Those rings up the side, now I tried to gauge how close they should be. This one suggests they're done in a spiral, which is so obvious when it's pointed out. I absolutely should have thought of that. I will definitely do that on the next one. Right, let's get back to those pesky knots. This report also agrees that there are 2 ends going through any given stitch. It just describes the knots as double knots, roughly 1 centimetre long. So that still isn't saying how he thinks that these have been made. It does say, though, that the original Harrisley hat has 120,000 knots on it. I'm just going to say that again. 120,000. And the reconstruction that was done of it took 6 months to recreate. That's unbelievable. I think this is the reconstruction. Oh no, yes, I think that's the Harrisley reconstruction. So that's a modern reconstruction. Took 6 months to make. You've probably already guessed I am not going to finish my hat before the end of the video. We are just going to try and do enough to make sure that I've got a solid plan for the next one I do. Now, that's not the only text I managed to get my hands on. The earlier text makes some very interesting comments about the different qualities of fabric that go into the hat, noting that the inner of the 3 layers is actually a much softer and stretchier fabric than the outer ones, and that the whole lot's full together after first assembly. That's really, really interesting. I'm going to revisit that on my next hat. For the moment, though, let's have a little look at these knots. Now, he does not spell it out, but in both of the texts there are diagrams. And the diagrams show 2 ends on 1 needle and really what looks just like 2 either overhand or slightly wrapped stopper knots. And I think it has got to be a stopper knot. So a stopper knot does come back to this idea of the bullion stitch. The idea is that it's something that will really, really hold well and not slide off. Let's have a very quick go with my yellow stunt thread so it's easy to see. Then we're going to try it in probably a slightly thinner thread. See what happens. Let's start off with a stopper knot. So a stopper knot on the end of a piece of thread is just a case of going round once as if for a normal knot, round twice. In this case I'm going to go around 3 times. I want a really chunky knot at this end. Pull that up. That is essentially the same as the bullion knot we tried before, except the end is sticking out and it's well wrapped in the loops of the bullion stitch. Now we can clip the ends of that fairly short. Schlabo's version, which I have no reason to doubt because he's certainly seen the original hats in minute detail, just puts the second knot onto the thread.
and 2 of them are set up this way. Then you take your stitch, so you'd have 2 ends coming out, and ideally I think you want this knot here to stop it pulling through. And now you have to finish the other end. So I think the first thing you do is you make your first knot, and if you make your knot but then you stick your needle back into the fabric, you can pull that knot down quite close to the fabric, which stops it wriggling through. Doesn't matter if there's a little bit of play on it. And then we make our stopper knot at the top, so needle at the same point. So this is very like the bullion stitch that I was trying before, but it lacks the doubling back version. Pull that up really, really, really nice and tight. Clip off the ends. And hopefully that gives us what we see. What I'm not happy about with this knot, and I've left these ends quite long, is that you get these little sticky out stalks. And even if you're cutting very, very tidily, you get these little sticky out stalks. I don't know if you can see that in the original. Maybe it's time. Maybe time has just worn them away. Anyway, this is now the best information we've got based on somebody who has actually handled and reconstructed the originals. I think we've got to go with his method as best we can. That has to be the way we do it. So let's try it with some more appropriate thread on the hat and see what happens. I'm fairly sure now that some of my problems with potential knot strategies have been that the yarn I've been using is relatively thick, and we know that the originals are much closer to a sewing thread. So I have just dyed some similar yarn but much, much thinner. This probably looks black on your screen. It's actually a very, very dark brown. It's a little bit darker than the stuff I've been trialling with so far. I need to wind that back into a ball, and we're going to try that, see if that makes for a better knot in a more classic style. And I'm still dithering about these knots, but we've got to try things and see what we can make work with the materials we've got available in a way that's in keeping with the evidence. I thought I'd just quickly show you something that I occasionally use for bobbins when I'm doing prehistoric things. These are tailbones. These are the tailbones of a sheep, and they were a beach find. And yeah, you can use toe bones. You sometimes find short leg bones. Most creatures have some suitable thing, and these ones were just found washed up on a beach with a carcass that was quite well weathered. So they make really, really nice little bobbins. We know that a lot of Bronze Age thread is wound onto sticks. Sticks are a very, very good option as well. I quite like using things that we know would have been around at the time, and it's a nod to the animal that the thread came from. Sheep bones for sheep thread. Let's do this on a bit of the hat that hasn't currently got anything else on it, so you can see what's going on. So I've threaded my needle with this nice fine dark thread, and I'm going to start by making my stopper knots in 2 ends. So I'm going to go around once, twice, through a little bit, 3 times, pull that up tightly. I'm really, really hoping that this being a finer thread means it's going to have more grip. Then I'm going to make my second knot, which I think is just an overhand, a little bit further down. I'm still not sure whether that should end up right against the fabric, in which case it could do with being a little bit lower, but we'll just try it. And then in the second end, we do exactly the same thing. So once, twice. Trying to do this whilst looking through the phone screen is making it just a tiny bit clumsy, but that's all right. So there's my stopper knot. I'm wondering if whether rubbing it with slightly moist fingers would help as well, whether that would full it slightly into place. I'm not going to worry too much. Okay, so I've got loose ends, which I'm going to need to clip. I am, of course, using scissors, and scissors are not really a Bronze Age thing. Shears do come in, but they're just as likely to have been working with something like a knife blade. Even a really sharp flint can be good. All right, so those are my two ends. Let me put those against my finger so you can see them. We have two stopper knots with a smaller knot behind them. So we'll line that up, take the stitch through the fabric. Now at this point, and this is the bit that I'm not so happy with, is you pretty much have to take things off the needle. And I'm going to need to put it back on the needle again in a moment. So the first knot is no major difficulty. I can use the needle to guide it into place. And I'll do the same with the second one. I'm guessing that working these sequentially is the best way to stop getting into a bit of confusion. So that bit is fine. But then this pretty much has to go back onto the needle. I'm also going to match the needle to the work. Right, so decide where it's going, about there. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pinch it tight, pull it through. That makes what is hopefully a stopper knot. Clip that off. Thread the second one, so the threads are coming on and off the needle, and that just, it doesn't feel right. Who knows? Who knows? I can't think of a sequence to work this. It doesn't rely on so much coming on and off the threads. Actually, that's snapped okay, but it leaves a very frilly end. Right, so there we go. If this is correct, and it's certainly closer to his diagrams, that is our sequence of working. What I need to do now is make a little patch of them, give them a day or two, and we'll see whether they quietly undo themselves, because some of these ends that you can see elsewhere on my hat are the thicker threads that at the time I tied knots in, and they have just quietly undone themselves. Do we think that looks better? You know, it probably does look better. Right, I'm going to do a bit more of this. Certainly not going to get the whole hat done, but let's do a little bit more and we'll assess whether we're on track, and then we will recap how you go about making a hat like this. Well, drat. I was feeling really positive about these. I'd done a few and they were looking pretty good. I'm zooming in as much as I can on the camera phone here. But look, can you see how a couple have just quietly undone themselves in the background? So, what is going on here? Is it me? It could be me. Am I just not doing these knots correctly? Is it the thread? Now, I did switch down to this finer one because I felt that my really lovely worsted spun, tightly plied thread, the stuff that is often used for tablet weaving, was springy and it was making it undo. Is it the thread? Is it just that I'm not using the right thread for this project? Or have I got the knot completely wrong still? I don't know. I just don't know the answer. I'm going to have to go back to the drawing board slightly on this and work out what is going on. Let's revisit my original method just in the finer thread. So I am not for 1 second suggesting that very well respected and experienced researchers like Margarita Hald or Karl Schlabo got the knot wrong. I am not suggesting that. What I am saying is that if I want to make something that looks like the original, I'm having to do it in a different way that their limited information is implying. And this is looking right to me. Particularly if I started with a single rather than applied thread. It's definitely better in this finer stuff. So this is the pull the thread through, make a bullion knot, finger ply it back on itself, take a little knot, take the stitch. There is no way that can undo itself. And I'm getting a result that gives me those little drumsticks, those little bobbles on plied stalks. I've got to make a decision at this point. I think the ideal would be to go back to basics with the yarn, get some fibre out of my stash that's a good match for Bronze Age woolen types, do some hyper fine spinning and try again. That would be the ideal. At this precise moment, I'd quite like to get on with this hat, and I don't think that's actually going to happen. So, do I go with this method, which looks sort of like the diagrams, except every single knot has this little sort of pip sticking out of the end where the thread comes out of it, and which in my, I don't know how many I did there, a dozen or so knots, 2 have unravelled? Or do I go with what is possibly very, very interpretive but works? And I can produce these reliably. They don't take any longer than doing this method, and they give me what I see on the originals looking at the photos. I'm not sure there's a right answer to this. This version is definitely going to be an interpretation. It's absolutely not going to be a replica. But is there a place for that? Does it give us a chance to finish one of these hats, wear it, try it out, hand it around? It's also my first go. Does it give me a chance to learn an awful lot about working order and construction as I go, and then I improve on it in my next version of this? You can sort of see which way I'm going, can't you? What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to mark out a square centimetre of this, and I'm going to work for an hour, perhaps. Let's see how much of the square centimetre I can fill in. Then we'll do a final assessment, which will probably take us to the end of this video because you must be getting really bored of watching me trying things out by this point. And let's see. 15 minutes in, and I have done roughly 1/4 of a centimetre. The stalks are coming out at roughly a centimetre long, which is great. So I think my centimetre square test is probably going to be a fair representation of an hour's work. I still haven't decided, but you know what? It is giving me the effect that I need. Let's see how it looks in another 45 minutes. And at the end of an hour, pretty much 1 square centimetre. There's very roughly 60 knots in that, so I was working about 1 a minute. Now, if you calculate that outwards into the 120,000 knots, which Slabo mentions is in the hats he examined, well, at my rate of working, allowing for doing other things, that's going to take me about a year to finish this hat. I expect I would get faster at these with a little bit of practice though. But what it really comes down to is this a reasonable method for this particular hat at this moment? And I still can't decide. It is not how they did it. I'm absolutely positive about that now. The little secondary knot that I've been putting in at the bottom is not presenting in the way that we see it. I'm quite happy with the little bullion knots. I'm not even unhappy with the folding the stalk back on itself. There isn't enough room to manipulate the little stalk by hand to make the secondary knot by looping that round. It's really just confirming my idea that that is not exactly how they're doing it. The question though is it a reasonable way of doing an interpretation where the materials that I've got available are not cooperating to make the knots hold? I've tried using beeswax. All that does is it gives me slightly chalky looking knots. Really not sure that something like sticky like beeswax is the way forward. So it comes down to technique. They are tying these knots in a particular way and potentially with a particular quality of thread. If anybody watching this has seen any of the originals down a microscope in person and has any insights, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I'm the very first person to say this is not quite right, and I'm okay with that. Experimental archaeology is about trying things out, it's about learning from our mistakes as we go, and it's about finding the right questions to ask. And like a lot of experiments, I have come out of this with more questions than I had right at the start. We've learned a lot though. Let's recap very, very quickly. We know that these caps are made of 3 layers, which are not all the same quality of fabric throughout. We know that the basic assembly is done, and then they're giving a second fulling to tighten and shrink them, and then they're blocked almost certainly on a wooden hat block. That's great. That's something we can definitely do. We know how the edges are worked. We've got this lovely rope edging worked onto a blanket stitch. We've had a couple of different insights into the spiral rings inside, spirals rather than concentric rings, which can be done either with a whipped running stitch, which is how Margarita Hald interprets it, or as a stem stitch, which is how Carl Schlabo interprets it. I think both are very, very good options. We're pretty comfortable about how the looped section that joins the 2 layers is done. That's really lovely to work and gives an excellent result. So far so good on that part. So the structure of the hat really not too problematic. But when I try the knots the way that they appear to be recorded, you can see several more of them have undone themselves now. Those knots don't hold. And I've had a really good look around at different knots, and that does appear to be the most likely stopper knot for the structure. Folding it back on itself gives me a very, very secure stopper knot, but it means my secondary knot isn't as prominent. Somewhere there's an answer to this, but this is going to have to do for now. Thank you for sticking it out. I know this has been a really long video, partly because I've kept discovering things, and I know there is more to discover about these hats. The next time I'm back in Denmark, I'm going to have another look at them. One of these days, I'm going to get to look at them down a microscope. For now, the finished hat to go with my Bronze Age outfit is going to have to wait, because I do not have 120 hours of work on this. But I'm going to chip away at it, and I'll try different things. I would love to hear your ideas if you've got a working theory as to how this particular knot is structured to give us something that really, really does look like those close-up pictures that we've seen from the museums. For now, happy crafting. Bye for now. I'm going away on an adventure. I'll be back in a few weeks, and then we'll start looking at projects for the autumn.